Hi, my name's Eric Reynolds. I'm the Associate Publisher and Vice President of Fantagraphics Books, and I am happy to welcome Conor Stechschulte to this conversation. How you doing, Conor?
I'm doing well. It's great to see you, Eric.
Yeah, you too. So where are you? You're in Chicago?
Yeah, I'm just west of the city. I'm in Berwyn, Illinois. It's like a just a little
Okay.
quiet suburb. It's just
Are,
just south of like Oak Park.
okay. Are you guys getting part of this like winter nightmare that
Yeah, we
everybody
got
else
it.
has got that way?
Yeah, we got it pretty hard. Yeah, we got about like a foot of snow last week, but it's like it was really warm yesterday, so now it's all melting. It's all ice next to my house here.
You're an artist, so do you have to leave the house much? Or...
I do now that the semester started. So I'm teaching two classes at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. So that gets me out of the house about 3 times a week. Um,
Oh, that's all in person these days.
yeah, it's all in person.
That's great.
The ones I'm teaching, yeah.
Um, well, let's talk about what we came to talk about. We're putting out the book Ultrasound, which was originally serialized under the title Generous Bosom.
Mm-hmm.
It's coming out in May, and I got a whole bunch of questions I can ask you about this book. I have to preface it by saying, you have some books that you want to remain spoiler free when you talk about them, and others where it's less important. And this is a book that I feel like is like I have to be more delicate in terms of discussing than most, because it's such a tightly plotted book
Thank
that I don't want to give anything away. So that leads to my first question, which is, how would you describe the book? How do you describe the book to a lay person? Because
you.
it is a really dense, thoughtful, and just kind of tightly wound, coil of a book.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, for as much as I like doing that in the writing of the book, I feel like I'm bad about being sensitive about spoilers. So my I'll try to give the synopsis with the caveat that I do tend to maybe give too much away. But I would say that it's a story about two characters that have a sort of one night stand together, and then sort of find themselves at the center of a web of conspiracy and manipulation, um, and it yeah, it forces them to sort of question everything they know about their own lives, um, and gets
It's
weird
to
and
my
gets
mind, we published your previous book,
mm-hmm.
The Amateurs, which I love. This is like a considerably different book in tone and really almost, I think, in kind of every way.
Yeah.
And so what was kind of the genesis for it? Not so much as like, where do you get your ideas, but this whole, again, this kind of tightly knit plot had to germinate from somewhere.
Yeah.
What was kind of what was your thought process going into it before you actually started, really making a book?
Yeah, I think um when it started, yeah, it's really funny. It's like you have all I always have, like probably like a dozen ideas that I'm like pretty excited about. And I don't know whether or not I'm going to dive into a book with them. And then it'll be like, once you find how you're going to draw it or something, then it's like, oh, I have like, I can get like a grip on this thing, and then I can start making it. So yeah, it was something about drawing the book in pencil that like gave me that grip
Hmm.
on it. I saw, I think it was like right around the time when I started, I saw this short comic by Clara Besayele. I think that's how you say her
Mhm.
name. The Face Man book that she put out with Domino Books.
Mhm.
And I was like, oh, this seems like a really beautiful way of drawing comics and being able to uh keep the artwork kind of open to editing and rearranging and stuff like that. So that was a big piece of it. And then the other ideas I think came from like I'd taken like two different cross country trips like 3 years apart from one another, and was thinking a lot about the vulnerability of being alone on a road and the way that like you could get trapped, which is sort of a central part of at least like the first quarter of the book or whatever. So it's sort of those two ideas. I was like, oh, I could draw it this way, and I like this idea of someone like a motorist being trapped in an isolated place.
That's super interesting on a couple of fronts, because one, the book does just like kind of hit the ground running with this great setup, which you've kind of described there. So it's interesting that, you just had that idea of as like a set piece for to launch a bigger story.
Yeah.
That's interesting. But then too, hearing you talk about the pencil, that kind of begs the question of the color in the book, because the color is also like really germane, I think, to the storytelling. So how did that come about? Was that like a byproduct of like you decided, oh, we're gonna serialize it on Rhizo, so let's figure out a way to make that work, or how to,
Yeah, it was sort of like it was like a there was like a narrative need for something like that I hadn't figured out yet. And then once I talked to Breakdown and they were like, yeah, we'd like to put out, whatever you're working on. And I was like, oh, I'm working on this thing. And I knew there was going to be the first bit that we're talking about with like the motorist and everything. There's narration, or it's at least like framed as being narrated by a character.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted that narration to interject a couple of times. And I had it just as like, like box text. Because I thought I was going to be Xeroxing the artwork. That was what I had access to at the time, was a Xerox machine.
Mm-hmm.
And then once I knew I had Risa, I was like, oh yes, I can just like overlay it over top, and that's perfect.
Yeah.
And so it was this nice sort of coming together of like the opportunity to use that tool and the need for it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's because it's employed in a really smart way that's kind of just germane to the storytelling, kind of, you need it. That's really cool. I think the book is, like right up my alley in the way that it's kind of like bait for fans of, the formal properties of comics. There's a lot going on there to talk about on a formal level. It's never in a way that's showy to me. Like I said, it's very organic to the story, and the story just kind of hits the ground running with this great, kind of mystery of and this character building of this guy who gets lost, blows his tires out in a storm,
Mm-hmm.
and ends up on a doorstep. And then this crazy layered narrative of conspiracy and well, I don't want to spoil it, but it's just, it takes so many left turns that it's the kind of book I've described as, as soon as you finish it, you want to go right back to the start to try to make sense of what you read in the best possible way, because you're really intrigued, and you really want to unpack it, and it rewards that kind of deeper dive in a way that not every comic does by any stretch.
Right.
Yeah, so that wasn't really a question, but
yeah, but I mean, I can talk about that because I feel like especially in like sort of the shorter like zines and books I've done over the years, I always, those always kind of come out of like some formal element of comics and wanting to kind of like dive into that. So that's like, I've always been very interested in kind of like just like the elemental parts of a comic and kind of looking at them each individually. And so I think it's sort of having explored them like in these individual ways in my shorter zines and stuff, I would then kind of fold it into the bigger narrative I was working on. And there was one other thing I wanted to say about, that and the thing you said about rereading too, I think that partly came out of releasing it serially as well, like kind of knowing that, when I get the next volume or the next like issue of a comic, I go back and read the first one again. And so wanting to have like the details in there that someone can pick up on that they wouldn't have gotten on a first gloss. And also I think in dealing with the formal elements of comics, especially like in the early days of working on comics, I was like I feel like fighting the reader a little bit to like read slower. And I think like in this,
Uh-huh.
I think even one of my earlier zines like has like a message in the front that says, please read slow. um, but I think instead of just like being a brat like that, what I found I like about comics too is like that they're sort of wide open in this way that like a prose novel or a movie, it's hard to like jump back to a moment in a movie or like to find exactly where it is in a prose novel because every page is just covered in letters, whereas like you open up a comic and you're in the scene. And so I think that it's a medium that allows you to kind of like hopefully keep the reader's attention, but have like details in there that then they can go back and find like kind of easily if
I
they're
totally
there.
agree. Yeah,
Yeah.
I totally agree. I remember like just some of the formative comics that really like got me hardcore into comics as an adult were things like a Velvet Glove, Cast in Iron,
Yeah.
or Black Hole, which
Yeah.
were being serialized. And it was the same for me. Before every time the new one came out, I'd have to go back and reread the previous one. So by the time you're reading like issue 8 of Black Hole, you've read number 1 8 times.
Yeah.
Um, and stuff just kind of continues to like reveal itself as you go back and look. And I totally appreciate that about comics too, the way that when you're reading a graphic novel you really can just flip back to an earlier scene in a way that you can't with a movie. So speaking of movies, let's talk about that.
Yeah. Sure.
You have had the very unusual experience where your book was optioned as a film before you'd even finished the book, and you were hired to write the film contemporaneously while finishing the book.
Yeah.
So you had to like put on two different hats and like kind of live like a little kind of schizophrenic existence, I imagine a little bit. Was that how?
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, it was really cool. So yeah, Rob Schroeder, the director of the Ultrasound movie, got in touch with me. I think it was in like around April of 2016. It was like a couple months after the second book had come out, which I thought was halfway through the whole book, but it turns out it's maybe only like a third,
Mhm.
or a quarter. Um, and so yeah, he was interested in adapting it for the screen in some fashion, and I didn't want to relinquish control of the story. I didn't want to like send an outline to some you know schmo to write it. And I was sort of like at a point in making the story where I was like, there's all these things I want to do. I want the story, all these places I want the story to go, and I'm not exactly sure how to do that. And I think I need to um do more like architecture
Oh,
ahead of drawing than I had done for the first two books. And so it kind of was nice timing where I went back through, adapted what I had into the script, and then kind of moved on from there, and then started drawing that stuff from the script. But I deviated where I needed to make the book feel each book after that feels solid, hopefully.
did
But
you like
yeah.
so congratulations on that too, because you really, you not only have now had a movie made of one of your books, but it's a good movie and it stands on its own and it's also faithful to the book. Yet it's its own thing in a way that's totally awesome. I loved it.
Thank you.
Um, and it's like it works as a film in the same way that the book works as a book.
Mm-hmm.
um but so is in terms of the where they deviate, like were the deviations kind of born from having to kind of economize for a 2-hour movie, or whereas the book you could kind of just let it breathe as much as you wanted? Because again, I'm just find it interesting that you really were like deeply into two different narratives at the same time that were largely the same but not the same. Like that had to just be a challenge.
Yeah, it got confusing, especially like I got to be out there on set for like 5 days of shooting, and there were moments where it would be like, we'd be discussing some like plot point and I'd be like, yeah, but then, you know, that's because of this. And be like, no, that's in the comic. That's not in the movie. I'd be like, oh shit. And it'll be like, there were like 6 different versions of the script and like 5 different versions of the comic in my head. And I was like, which one did I actually draw? Which one did I actually write? It got kind of confusing, but what was the first part of your question? I went off on that.
Oh, I don't know. I was just kind of fascinated by that having to,
Yeah. Oh, you were talking about the differences, like where did they
oh
arise?
yeah, where it deviates, in the
Yeah,
film.
I think largely it was like the economizing and having to just like pare the script way down and move really quickly. And then yeah, there's a funny thing where you know, you write the plan or the script for a page, and then when you go to draw it, it becomes very clear what's wrong about it.
Right.
You're like, oh no, like they wouldn't say this, they would say this. Oh, this doesn't make sense because this character's like on the other side of the room and this character's over here. So, you know, you have to like negotiate that stuff. And so there were things like that in the script that I didn't realize until I got to draw them.
Yeah, I understand. That makes sense. I was just last week talking to Alex Graham.
Oh yeah.
And we were talking about how as a cartoonist, it's hard. If you're not a cartoonist, it's hard to understand how much the drawing informs the writing, and the storytelling.
Yeah.
Even if you write, out a script or whatever, if you're writing and drawing your own work, some of the stuff just doesn't come into clear view until you're really working it out, as
Right.
pictures.
Yeah, and there was stuff that I was like, oh man, I wish I had had a crack at drawing this before they filmed it. You know. And and I feel like it's also a whole nother like set of muscles and skills, or like an imaginary faculty to be like, oh, what's this going to look like when people are saying these things in a space, versus I think I've seen in interviews Dan Klaus like talking about the difference between like what sounds good on a comic page versus what sounds good out of a person's mouth,
Right.
being 2 different things. And I was like, when I read that, I was like, I don't really. And then I had a very firsthand experience of being like, oh yeah, that seems weird, but like, or maybe it's just like having control over the actors 100% when you're drawing, and you can make something seem more natural by contorting their body or something, whereas somebody else has to like then embody that. It becomes a bit of a bigger challenge.
Yeah, sometimes I think, and maybe this is like a slight limitation of comics, but sometimes I think that an author or cartoonist, hears dialogue a certain way in their head, that when read, verbatim on the page as a reader, you don't necessarily read it or hear it the same way it was intended.
Yeah.
Because there is like a, it's still what you're hearing in your head is still filtered through just what the words look like, written down. And it's like, sometimes it's like looking at a text, like, the tone of an email or a text sounds different than if spoken.
Totally. Yeah.
But so the movie seems like it's been pretty successful so far. Can you just what can you tell me about that? I know it was at the Tribeca Film Festival?
Yeah, it premiered at Tribeca, and then it played at the Fantasia Fest, which is like a sci-fi and horror festival in Montreal. And we got the Silver Audience Award there. And then we played at Fright Fest in London. And I feel like I'm definitely going to forget a couple other festivals, but then, yeah, it also played at the Mammoth Lakes Festival, and Rob, the director, got like best director or something like that there, which is amazing.
Something like that.
Yeah. I think it was best director. Yeah. I think it was best director of like narrative feature.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's awesome. And so it's going to be in theaters in the spring and then streaming in the summer.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's hitting theaters and like video on demand in March, and then I think it'll be on a streamer in June.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So how about tell us about the characters in the book, because you've got basically 3 primary characters, although depending on how you kind of slice it.
Mm.
But the book is like, it's funny to hear you saying like it's playing at Fright Fest and things, because it sort of
Mm.
positions it as like a genre film,
Yeah.
um, which I guess it certainly is in many ways, but it's also like just a really great character drama,
Mm-hmm.
and thriller. And I think at its core, it's the relationship between Glenn and Cindy that is the heart of the book, that really makes you care about all this crazy shit that's going on around them. And so how did those characters kind of begin? It sounds like if you already said that you thought of that scene of Glenn, driving in the rain. Um, but was Glenn then, or was he just some guy driving in the rain?
Yeah, it's hard to say like where they, yeah, because it's like, drawing a comic is such a long process. And um I think now, as I'm sort of preparing some new projects, I'm like doing a little bit more like work ahead of time, being like, this character, they're kind of like this and they wear these kind of clothes. I sort of brought the characters in and had them start interacting, and then I was like, okay, who are you, what's going to happen, in the process of writing and drawing it, more than a kind of like ahead of time planning and deciding. And so yeah, I feel like they each kind of found their personality on the page, really,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of in a slow evolving way. And especially like, yeah, I mean, like the way I drew them and everything changed, um
Right.
especially in the first book. Like I doubled back and redrew like I think the first 10 pages
Mm-hmm.
when the first book came out, and then that was like another place where I went back and I redrew a couple pages and a couple panels for the collection too, because the faces just changed so much that it looks like a totally different character, um in a couple instances. But yeah, I knew what the characters were going to do with one another. I knew what they're sort of like, how they were triangulated.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't know a whole lot about their background. That was sort of something that kind of fell into place more and more as the story came along. Yeah.
Because Cindy's just, a deeply sympathetic character.
Mm.
Uh, that, kind of just wonder where you found her, as in terms of how you found it within yourself to write a character like that, who made, basically maybe made some bad decisions early on in life, and that, had lifelong repercussions. And um, but one of the things, but aside from, I don't know, you could talk about that in a second if you want, but
Mm-hmm.
one of the things I wanted to say was that I really like about the book is, the way that, I guess Glenn and Arthur in particular, in very different ways, are both sort of unreliable narrators.
Mm-hmm.
Um, both like Glenn when he's talking to his buddy, and telling him about what happened, and then also just in terms of, Arthur's deception, um, and the way that you sort of formally show that in the storytelling,
Yeah.
in the way that you have, characters telling you things that you're also visually seeing distinct contradictions to. And it just kind of adds to, that's almost sounds kind of too simple, because it's really, I think it's a really kind of sophisticated device that you use, um, to keep the reader guessing and to keep the story propelling forward in a way that makes you want to turn the page, because you're just, trying to unpack who's telling the truth, who's up to what. um,
Right.
and you must have had like a ton of note cards that you were juggling at various points.
Yeah, sort of. I mean, the process early on, I sort of, I'll just like usually just like write out dialogue, and then from like the written dialogue break it into pages and stuff. And then I just had like sort of mile markers way out ahead of me, there I was like, I want them to get to this point, I want this character to be doing this.
Mm-hmm. How do we get from A to B?
Yeah, and it was just sort of like filling in the gaps. Yeah, but I think the like unreliable narrator thing uh perhaps connects to what we were talking about with the sort of formal elements of comics, and kind of thinking about, yeah, I just do a lot of thinking especially nowadays too, about like what narrative is, how it functions in our lives. And so I think that's like one of the main subjects of this book is like what control does narrative have on our lives, like how in control of the various narratives that build our identities and build really our whole entire reality.
Yeah.
How in control of those are we? How malleable are those stories? And so yeah, it just came out of just like really loving the possibility of like a story to be many different things at once.
I was just this, I don't know how much this really relates to that, but it reminds me, I was just listening to um, a court deposition given by Stan Lee on Ed Piskor and Jim Rugg's Cartoonist Kayfabe.
Yeah, I just listened to that too.
And there was a really fascinating moment where Stan Lee is, in court here in like whatever year it was, 2005, 2010, something like that.
Yeah.
And he's being asked questions about, the creation of the Fantastic Four. And he gives this, sort of well-worn anecdote about like the president of Marvel, the publisher of Marvel, going golfing with, a guy from DC who was bragging about the Justice League, and so he came back and said, we need a team book, blah, blah, blah. But my point in the story is that he tells this in court, and then as evidence, entered into evidence is an interview that he gave in like 1967 to some radio station. And so, some what, 40 years earlier,
Yeah.
where he tells the same story. Oh, where he tells the same story. Are you there?
Yeah.
And it is, the anecdote is like to a word exactly the same.
Right.
To a point where you wonder, like, has the story just been told so many times that that's become the reality?
Yeah, it just takes on its own momentum, and
where even he believes it,
right. Yeah, exactly.
But
exactly.
who knows if it even happened,
Yeah. It's stuff like that, like questions, and the way that is just really, when you really start to think about that stuff, it makes your experience of reality quite strange. In the way you're like, oh, I keep like running over this memory, and that's a really like important part of my identity. Like, what if I'm, just like recording over the tape over and over again until I'm like, right, this is the tape. This is definitely the tape. Listen.
Right. Well, so you finished the book, I guess, more or less now, a couple of months ago.
Yeah.
What have you been doing since?
Yeah. I've been working on like some new stories, been scripting some new things. That's been the bulk of it. And then a little bit of music stuff too. Okay. Been doing stuff with the band and a little bit of home recording, but just sort of trying to lay the groundwork a little bit for some new projects. I haven't it's like, what I was talking about before, where it's like you have the story idea and then like how, like formally how it'll look, start to come together. I haven't like had that intersection yet, so I haven't started actually drawing a new project yet, but I've been doing a lot of writing.
Great.
Yeah.
And tell me about teaching a little bit, because I imagine I could see you being a really great teacher. You're very thoughtful about your own work. And how long have you been doing that now?
I've been doing it on my own for almost 5 years, like since about 2017. But when I was in grad school at SAIC, I also like taught 2 classes with a grad student friend.
And what are you primarily teaching?
Yeah. What's that?
Are you primarily teaching like comic storytelling?
No, actually, most of the classes I teach are in like printmaking and self-publishing. So most of them are like offset printing and risograph printing focused. And then I have one class that's called comics to print. That's like it's risograph printing, but you make comics to print on the risograph. Comics to print. So I'm teaching that one right now, which is great because it didn't run in the fall when it usually does. So it's been like a year since I've taught it, and it's been really fun getting to talk about comics. A lot of the folks that take my other classes, there's usually at least half a dozen folks that are making comics in each class, but it's great to have a class where you can just, I don't have to worry about like alienating the people who are there to make like photo books or whatever. I can just
So what is print? Tell me about what print means to you, because you you just said like this book was, in part, the visual look of it was dictated by how it was going to be printed.
Yeah.
And you're teaching a course called, directly about reproducing your work in a physical form.
Yeah.
So that, I mean, what does print really mean to you? Yeah, leave it at that.
Yeah, a lot of different things. I mean, in that class, I taught it's like right in the top of the syllabus is like the philosophy of this class is that comics is a social medium, that a comic is not finished until it is printed and circulated. And I believe that. But I also think, like, in a broader way, like in the other classes that I teach, just talking about the power of self-publishing and self-determination around the distribution of your work. Those things are vitally important to me. Just like taking that power into your own hands. If you learn how to print, you don't have to wait. You don't have to get permission from anybody. You can make whatever you want. And yeah, I mean, I just think that that's like, I hopefully I'm able to communicate that to the students, because I think that's a really powerful thing. And like when I was in undergrad, when I was like an art student, getting to print and give away your work was such a powerful thing for me, that really like solved all of these anxieties and problems that arise, especially I think in art school, where you're like, I'm making tons and tons of artwork, and then I show it to like a dozen people, and some of them say shitty things about it, and then and then it's over. And then where do I put it? And then what is this for? Where am I going? Like, where is it going to be in the world? Like, once I leave school, I don't understand any of these things. And unfortunately, in a lot of art schools and a lot of classes, professors don't do a lot of explaining as to like what it means to like live as an artist, and like where does art actually go in the world, and what are the economic realities of that. Like, you don't hear a lot of that in art school, at least when I was in school. But that anxiety like just like went away when me and my friends, like, we printed up our comics and we set them out like on like the front desks of every building at our art school, and we watched them disappear. We're like, our artwork is in the world. Like, we didn't have to like get into a gallery. We didn't have to get juried into a show. It was out in the world. And then we would like see it left at a table in a cafe like miles away and be like, whoa, it's like out there. And so that magic has not worn off, really. And that's really what I'm trying to like get folks excited about, because I think that it can be really alienating if you're trying to like game out what people want from you and your art, and like where are you going to find your place in the world. But if you're just like, no, this is it, here it is, you lay it on the table. And I think that like that is, I think that's how and why I've had any like success at any of these things I've done, is because I didn't wait around for someone to ask me to do it. And I think that that's the best way. That's what I tell the young folks that I meet: don't wait around.
I think that's killer. I think awesome. I mean, I think that's how I met you. I think you just sent me your book. You just
I think so.
Made it and put it in the mail and was like, hey, look at it. And I did, and I liked it.
Yeah.
Well, that's a great place to probably wrap it up. I've enjoyed talking to you. And I can't wait for people to see the book and to see the movie. They're both coming out around the same time.
Yeah.
Congratulations on both, and
thank you.
Thanks a lot, man.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for taking the time to do this, and thank you so much for all the work you've put in on the book already, and I really appreciate Fantagraphics taking it on. Thank you so much. It means a lot to be a part of it.
I couldn't be more happy to publish it. It's a fantastic book. Cool. All right. Take care.